Noswaith dda bawb, a chroeso cynnes iawn i chi gyd yma ato ni i Brifysgol Bangor. A very warm welcome to you all here to Bangor University. Felly diolch yn fawr iawn i chi am ymuno fy ni heno yma ar gyfer darlith gyhoeddus gyntaf yr athro Marco Tamburelli. Mae'r darlithoedd hyn yn ddathliad o gyflawniad academaidd ac yn rhoi cyfla gwerthfawr i rannu perthnasedd cymdeithasol ein hymchwil gyda'n cymuned. Thank you for joining us this evening for the inaugural public lecture of Professor Marco Tamburelli. These lectures are a celebration of academic achievement and provide a valuable opportunity to share the societal relevance of research with our community. Felly, heno, da ni yn cael y fraint o glywed gan yr athro Marco Tamburelli, ieithydd o fri yma ym Mhrifysgol Bangor. So this evening, we are honoured to hear from Professor Marco Tamburelli, and as most of you will be aware, he's a distinguished linguist here at Bangor University. Marco leads the Language Attitudes Research Team and directs the International Research Network on Contested Languages. His research focuses on bilingualism and multilingualism, with particular emphasis on minority and regional languages. Marco's work combines social linguistics, quantitative methods, and the study of linguistic attitudes to examine how languages interact, evolve, and confront challenges in today's societies. His expertise makes him a leading figure in the study of language diversity and its preservation. In this lecture, Marco will explore the rich topic of linguistic diversity, focusing on its global significance and its unique presence within Europe. He will address key questions about the value of linguistic diversity, the threats it faces, particularly the alarming reality that 70% of the world's languages are endangered, and what can be done to protect this crucial part of human culture. Dwi'n siŵr y bydd y ddarlith heno yn ysbrydoli ni i fyfyrio ar ein rola ni fel sbardinwyr newid, gan gynnig cipolwg ar sut y gallwn ni gael effaith gadarnhaol ar ein cymunedau ac ar draws ffiniau. I trust this evening's lecture will inspire us to reflect on our roles as agents of change, offering insights into how we can make a positive impact both in our communities and across borders. Felly, heb oedi dim pellach, without further ado, I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Professor Marco Tamburelli to deliver his lecture this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Antley. After an introduction like that, the only possible outcome is disappointment. I will try and limit that as much as possible. So we're talking about linguistic diversity, and I thought we can have a bit of an overview of where it lives, what it is, and how it's being addressed or threatened in the modern world. And I specifically want to focus on Europe for two reasons. One is because it's the area I know a little bit about, and so it's entirely due to my ignorance. And the other is because when we think of linguistic diversity, we tend to think of, or generally, people tend to think of exotic places, like Papua New Guinea, which obviously has huge linguistic diversity. But at the same time, linguistic diversity is actually something that is a lot closer to home. And I thought it might be nice to kind of see that side of things. Of course, it's also something that is widespread around the world. And as a consequence, as Antley has already hinted at, so is the threat of language loss. Whenever you have linguistic diversity, which is basically everywhere on Earth, usually if you have a village with more than 25 families, you already tend to get different dialects. And if you start getting bigger than that, things escalate pretty quickly, and you end up with diversity to large extents and also quite serious differences. And we know that, unfortunately, only some languages have been successful. And if you look at, for example, the UNESCO Atlas for the world's languages in danger, you see two things. You see how linguistically diverse the world is, and also the degree of danger that diversity is experiencing. So this is a shot from the Atlas, and you can see every pin is a language, and every pin is a language that is endangered to some degree. So this is only considering the endangered languages. So you do not have, for example, English or German there, right? So you can see that it is everywhere, and certainly Europe is no exception. You can hardly see the map of Europe buried under the pins. The only places where you have very little is because, well, there are no people, usually because it's freezing. So we can see that at a glance that we are talking about something that is as common as humans on this planet. A map that, I know this can be a little bit depressing, so I've got a map that is a bit more colorful because we don't want to start with something like that. Well, we do, it makes sense, but we want to try and move on. A map that I like particularly is this one, which has been going around the internet, and this is a map of the minority language mostly spoken in each country. So you can see that we have the most spoken minority language in the UK is Welsh, and then German in France, Catalan in Spain, and so on. This is a map that tries to do that. There are several. I like this one because it's got Sicilian in it. But I also like this one because it has Scots in it, and I do have a soft spot for Scots. But also because it's a little bit less focused on official languages, and it also includes languages that the UNESCO recognizes as in danger, but may not necessarily be thought of as languages. Maybe people think of them as patois or as sort of broken German, French, Italian, fill the gap here. So for example, Alemannic in France, you see German actually becomes Alemannic when you look at the actual linguistic differences. And also, this is to make Florian happy, who I know is in the audience. But although they are slightly different, you can see that more positively, so to speak, we're not talking about the languages in danger as such, we're talking about the minority or minoritized languages. And there are more colors, which are always a good thing. But you can see that linguistic diversity is not something that is limited to faraway lands. It's something that is actually historically very much a European thing, as well as obviously anywhere else in the world. If we look at the Atlas World Language of the world's languages in danger, we may also get a picture of European countries that we may not always be expecting. So I know there are some of my students in the audience, and I know you know the answer to this, so please be quiet for 2 minutes. I'm just going to ask the rest of the audience about the languages of the UK, and specifically if we think of the languages that are indigenous to the UK, because of course we know that there are a lot of languages that may have come through immigration. That's kind of something that might be uninteresting from a linguistic point of view. We all know that is true. But we don't all know that the linguistic diversity of, for example, the UK also is quite, the country is quite linguistically diverse, even if we limit ourselves to the so-called indigenous or autochthonous languages. So who would like to make a guess how many languages are indigenous to the UK? Give us a number. Someone who's not a linguist.
7.
That is a good guess.
6.
You're going in the wrong direction. It's actually 11. You have obviously, well, it has to be at least one, right? It's at least Welsh. We know that, right? But you have the other Celtic languages, like Manx and Cornish, which have seen a little bit of a revival recently. You have the different varieties of French, which to some degree have changed so much from each other that are considered different languages, spoken in the British Isles, and Scots, Gaelic, and so on. Yiddish, of course, which is indigenous to the whole of Europe, although originally comes from Germany, but it's been spoken in every European country for so long that it's basically considered an indigenous language of every European country. So you see that linguistic diversity is actually something that is a little bit, and as I said, this is limited to the indigenous languages. Don't even start on, other languages that are spoken in the UK, because then we end up with very large numbers. So it's something that is really in our doorstep. Let's look at another example, which is, I think, particularly representative of this, and that's Italy, not just because I happen to come from a place which is currently under Italian administration, but also because Italy is particularly, I think it's a particular example when we think of, France, people speak French, Italy, people speak Italian. But the truth is actually a lot more interesting than that, right? So I'm just going to tell you it's more than 11. Give me a number. 26. Ooh, you're getting close. You're getting really close.
28. 29. 30.
Yes! We have a winner. The lady in the blue top. Yes, so the Atlas lists 30 languages for Italy. And the reason why I brought this in is because it's quite representative of the variety, even when you think about the different language families. There's almost a language for every family of every major European language family, apart from the Celtic languages. Interestingly, because the earliest Celtic inscriptions are in Italy, right? The earliest we know of anyway, but there is no Celtic language surviving in Italy. So you have the Germanic languages here. Did you see that animation? It took me ages. You better be impressed. You have the Germanic languages. You have the Greek varieties, which are Hellenic languages, so related to Greek. We don't really know if this is from the Byzantine period or from the pre-Roman period. So people disagree as to why, but it's clear that they have been there for at least 5 centuries, probably 2,000 years. So we don't really know exactly, but they are endogenous to Italy, obviously, because they've been there for at least 5 centuries. Then you have the Slavic languages, Rhaetian and Molise Croatian, again, that have been spoken there for centuries. So we're not talking about languages that have recently arrived. And then we have Arbëresh and Romani, which is spoken pretty much in every country in Europe because it's the language of the traveling community, or a traveling community, and Arbëresh, which is related to Albanian. So they don't get a circle because there aren't any other languages related to them. They are Indo-European, so they are distantly related to the other 4 groups, but they don't have any direct relatives. And then, of course, you have the Romance languages, which are the daughters of Latin. They have had different degrees of luck in terms of being recognized and in terms of the degree of danger they find themselves in. And so, again, you see that you have quite a rich tapestry of linguistic variation that's not just limited to the borders, right? We all accept that people who live near borders are a bit odd, and so you end up with variation. But this is actually, across the whole country. You start with Sicilian in the deep south, and you go all the way to the Germanic languages that border with Switzerland and Austria. So you end up with a very broad range across the country. So this is a nice map that I like, which shows linguistic diversity a little bit more. And it's colorful, doesn't have all those black pins which spell death. I particularly like this picture. I'm not 100% sure I remember why I put it there, like in terms of relevance to the content. But I like it because it shows 2 people who, on the face of it, come from possibly very different cultures and from very different backgrounds, and maybe have very, very different experiences. But both of them were at a gathering for the protection of their language. And it's something that, again, underscores how widespread around the globe this issue is, and how many people people's languages are threatened. So this is the how bit, right? We've seen And, yeah, okay, it's come back on. I wish languages did that. Oh yeah, it's safe. No worries. Yeah, unfortunately, it's more complicated. So this is the how in the sense of linguistic diversity. What do we mean? And also the where, right? What does it mean and where is it? The next question, which is by far the most difficult one, is why should we bother with it? And I want to start with a very simple quote from an elder of the American Indian Language Development Institute. I speak my favorite language because that's who I am. We teach our children our favorite language because we want them to know who they are. I think you don't get any more connected to humanity than that, right? You have the language that you feel is who you are. And I think that is quite, we could just leave it there and say, well, that's who you are. You can only be who you are. Surely you can't be someone else. I guess you can pretend if you're good. But I also think of myself as a scientist, so it's nice to look at some numbers. Actually, we won't really look at numbers, but we're going to look at another angle, which is, well, it's also good for you, or at least there is some evidence in that direction, although there is a bit of controversy in some cases. But there is some evidence in the direction that it is good for you. And to some degree, it's quite obvious that it's good for you if you speak French and German. Well, you can get more jobs. It's not as obvious whether you can get more jobs if you speak French and Alemannic, or English and Occitan. It's not obvious. But there is evidence that you get some cognitive benefits, regardless of whether the languages you speak happen to be economically attractive or not. So I'm going to discuss something that some of you may have come across before, which is certain benefits that bilingualism may bring about, but I'll use examples that you may not have come across before. And one such example is from Friesland, which is in the north of the Netherlands. And in Friesland, you have Frisian-Dutch bilinguals. Frisian and Dutch are related, so it's not quite the same situation as you get in Wales. Obviously, Welsh and English are also related, but distantly, whereas Frisian and Dutch are more closely related, so it's closer to the Spanish-Catalan situation. And there's been some research on the cognitive abilities of children age 5 to 6 who are brought up in Frisian and Dutch, and the researchers have shown certain benefits to do with what we call executive functioning, which sort of loosely speaking means remaining able to concentrate on things even when there are distractions involved. I'm being very simplistic, but that's basically the general idea. So selective attention, being better at switching certain distractions off and selectively focusing your attention on something specific. Already between the age of 5 and 6, there was evidence that they can do that more naturally and more quickly when you put them in certain lab situations compared to monolinguals. And the general idea is that, well, you do that all the time with two languages, right? When you speak one language, you have to kind of tone down the other because you can't speak two languages simultaneously. You can mix them, but you can only say one word at a time, right? So you have to kind of turn down the volume on the other language, and vice versa. When you speak the second language, you have to do that with the first. So you have this kind of juggling all the time, and it seems to be seeping into your other cognitive abilities so that you can focus better even when you're doing things that are not linguistic. And this is not limited to Frisian Dutch. Bilinguals, similar studies have been done with Gaelic English and Sardinian Italian bilinguals. So Gaelic English obviously in Scotland, and Sardinian Italian in Sardinia in Italy. And in this case, the children were a little bit older, between the ages of 8 and 10. And similar benefits on cognitive control, problem-solving abilities were found. Metalinguistic awareness, which is basically a better understanding of how your language works, and arguably that helps with learning a third language because you have a bit more awareness of the nuts and bolts of language. Catalan Spanish, similar situation. Before I move on to that, I think what makes this particularly interesting as well is that Sardinian and Italian are both Romance languages, whereas Gallic is a Celtic language and English is a Germanic language, so they're a bit further apart from each other, and yet the benefits were found in both groups, although with some differences, suggesting that linguistic gap between the two languages may play a part, but doesn't necessarily act as a necessary condition, right? It might play a part, but you can also have the advantages if the languages are related or closely related. And Catalan and Spanish is a similar situation. The two languages are relatively closely related. They're both Romance languages. And a similar type of research program has looked at adults in this case who have also shown benefits to do with attentional, being more efficient at focusing attention. So as I said, some of you may have known that there are benefits to bilingualism, but you may not have come across the cases like these. And I'm deliberately not discussing Welsh because there's been some disagreement and because Professor Anthony Thomas is in the audience, so I don't want to make a fool of myself. So I'm going to swiftly ignore Welsh, but we'll talk about Welsh in a minute. Obviously, we have to. So we started with, well, we need to think about maintaining linguistic diversity because that's really profoundly part of what it means to be a human, is to have a language that you feel is part of who you are. And then we looked at, well, but there are also some practical advantages which don't hurt, right? And the positive side of bilingualism or multilingualism was actually relatively well known in most European cultures. So if you look at these two citations, which tend to be related to two particular people, but actually there are proverbs in a lot of languages of the world to a similar extent. So you have proverbs that are probably hundreds, maybe thousands of years old, along the lines of the more languages you speak, the more human you are. The idea that in order to connect with people, you need to have some diversity of language. I know there are proverbs to this kind of, in this spirit, in Chinese, in Czech, I believe, which is not a coincidence that both of these are Slavic speakers, because you have similar proverbs in Czech and Russian, and I am missing another Slavic language that might come to me later. But these sort of predate all the research that we just discussed by centuries. We're talking about proverbs. And in a way, it makes sense because the obsession of monolingualism is relatively modern. A colleague of mine once said, empires might have done a lot of bad things, but they didn't care what language you spoke. As long as you paid the taxes to the emperor, you can speak whatever you want. The problem started when we started to salute the flag. Then we need something that kind of groups us together. And you may or may not blame the French for it. That's a different discussion. But during empires, you had a lot of linguistic diversity that didn't matter so much because you didn't have the idea of nation necessarily, and as one people, under one God, with one language. So the idea that monolingualism is desirable is actually quite recent. It's unsurprising that proverbs that date back centuries actually accepted that and were very positive about that. Of course, it's not always like that. You also have old myths that are against multilingualism. I guess the Tower of Babel is possibly the best known one. The idea that if you have linguistic diversity, you're in trouble. And that's something that, as I said, has become particularly prominent, certainly in Europe and definitely, and also in the countries that have modeled themselves on European countries. The idea of nation building as a monolingual system, and for those who like multisyllabic words, vernacularization. Because of course you cannot stop people from speaking their language tomorrow morning, but you can tell them that it's not a real language. You can tell them that it's basically a dialect or a patois or whatever unpleasant word you can come up with, and say, this other thing that I'm giving you, this is a language. And so everything else becomes a vernacular, becomes a lesser than. And you need to follow whichever monolingual ideology happens to be the one that allows us to build the nation. I don't want to mention the French again, but okay, I won't. I'll mention the Italians. This geezer, who, despite having a fantastic tash, has said and done some questionable things. And one of them, which is particularly famous, when he presided over the, or was one of the politicians who oversaw the invention of Italy in the late 1800s, late 1850s. He said, "We have made Italy, now we must make Italians," referring to the fact that there wasn't a single group, certainly not linguistically, and possibly also not in relation to other cultural or ethnic structures, but certainly linguistically. It was, it was such a big question that a lot of ink was used up to discuss this language question. What are we going to do now? We've got a country, we've got all this linguistic diversity. What are we going to do about, trying to bring it together? And I'm talking about Italy just because it's nice to have a go at them. But I could say the same thing about France. I could say the same thing about Germany. I could say the same thing about Spain. Similar situations have Poland. Similar situations have happened all over Europe when nation states were built, and you find yourself in a linguistic melting pot where you have maybe related languages, but also some distantly related, and you don't have a common tongue. Then you need to do something about it, or you see yourself as needing to do something about it. And unfortunately, the route that was taken was that the other languages need to be abandoned, which is of course not the only possible route, right? Because you could introduce Italian, German, French, and so on, and still keep the other languages. You could foster multilingualism with this new thing that we all need. You could imagine the discussion saying, okay, we need a language that we all understand. Come on, people, otherwise this is a mess. But you don't have to abandon what you already speak, right? We can have both, which of course has happened in some cases, but has not been the rule. The rule has been reducing everything else to just less than a language, a vernacular, a patois, a dialect, and so on. And so this is an attitude, and that's the key word that I'm going to carry on with for a bit. It's an attitude that is really profoundly rooted in European nation states. The attitude of one language and everything else is kind of a bit annoying, and I wish it wasn't there because it makes things difficult. I think Eddie Izzard has said it best, and no lecture is complete without a quote from him. 2 languages in one head? No one can live at that speed. Good Lord, man, you're asking the impossible. And that's kind of the summary of the last 200 years, linguistic policy of well, maybe not the last 200 years, but the 200 years up to about 1970s in Europe has been pretty much this, right? One language, don't speak language X, Y, Z to your children because they need to learn this, which is the important one, and so on. So that's kind of very, as I said, deeply ingrained in European nation states under the idea of monolingualism as a desirable thing. It's an attitude. And that's where my research and of the team of people who work with me has been going towards, exactly because attitudes keep coming back as quite fundamental to whether languages or which languages have a future and the extent to which languages may have a future. And I was looking for a nice quote on attitudes, and I found this, but then I had to fact check it, and apparently Churchill never said that. I wish I wasn't such a perfectionist, I could have just lied, but no. But I still kind of agree with it, except for the bit that says it's a little thing. It's actually a big thing. It's a Churchillian thing, but it's apparently never been said by Winston Churchill. But it still holds that attitudes can make a big difference. And of course, in Wales in particular, you see similar situations in Catalonia, I would say, and the Basque Country. Possibly those are the three cases in Europe that have been most active and most successful in maintaining their languages. And a lot has been done, of course, to make people see the languages positively. Of course, the media play an important part in that. The fact that the languages are in school, the bilingual signs, legitimizing the bilingualism, that is actually how people live day to day, rather than just keeping it hush-hush, as has happened in many places for many years. And besides producing speakers, of course, like schools do, or improving the skills, it also feeds into how people perceive the language, and therefore the attitudes that people have towards the language. And in sociolinguistics, it's generally accepted that attitudes are an important barometer for how a language is doing. And we can see that in extreme cases that makes perfect sense. You know, if I think that the language of my forefathers is basically a throat infection, I am not going to pass it on to my children because I don't want them to feel that they are lesser than the people who speak this other language, which I happen to think very highly of, and so I'm going to speak a different language to them. So you can see, at least in some cases, attitudes come in quite fundamentally in possibly being a major ingredient in whether a language has a future, basically whether it's passed on to the next generation. It's not always a one-to-one relation, but there is clearly some relation between the two. And so the work that we've been doing with the LART project, for which I need to profusely thank Florian Bright and Janto Griffith, who are in the audience and who've done fantastic work, Lysander Brasca, who is back in Italy, and also Maylor Jones, who's just joined us. What we've been trying to do with this project is to look at attitudes in different situations, looking at Khmer English, of course, but also languages that have been less fortunate, that may not have had, or less successful, shall I say, because you don't really get language protection by fortune. You actually have to fight for it, but have been less successful. For example, Mosel-Frankisch, which is a Germanic variety spoken in Belgium, and it's in a bilingual situation. Those of you who are from a linguistic background, bilingual and diglossic situation with German. And in my homeland, Lombardy, where we looked at Lombard Italian speakers. And these are interesting comparisons, particularly because they are very different from the point of view of how they are promoted or not promoted by official institutions. So obviously I don't have to explain the Welsh situation, but in Belgium, the language itself is not really recognized, although the speakers are kind of recognized as a German minority. So there is kind of some timid recognition there, but not a fully fledged recognition as a bilingual German Franconian population. In Lombardy, the situation is terrible in the sense that Italian is the only official language. Lombard has no recognition. It's one of those cases that you might not think of as endangered because there are millions of speakers, although data is very estimated. but possibly between 2 and 3 million of speakers, and you think, oh, well, 3 million of speakers, you're doing fine. Yes, until you look at the average age. And we all know that people have a habit of dying, and so it's kind of, when the average age goes up, then it doesn't matter if you have millions of speakers. So the situation is a bit of a continuum from a language with a good degree of recognition and a language with no recognition and something in between. So we wanted to look at the full range like that. And we've done a number of data collection exercises involving some that are very highly technological, which I won't tell you about because the problem with highly technological data is that it's very, very intricate and we're still swimming in it. And also with conversational studies and so on, which this is a small parenthesis. On the 13th of November, we're going to have an event in Pontio where we're going to discuss more of the Welsh data in particular. So it will be in the events list. So I will circulate something so that people who are interested in that can come and learn more about it. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to tell you about one particular thing that we did, which is sort of relatively simple, but at the same time very insightful. So I don't know if you can see the words because they might be a bit small. But basically, we just simply asked people what they think about, for example, English and then Welsh. And then we did the same in the other two locations, right? So do you think the language is pleasant or unpleasant? Move the slider between pleasant and unpleasant. And unstructured or structured. Of course, all languages are structured, right? No language involves pulling words out of a hat and throwing them on the table at random. All languages have some sort of structure, but there are languages that are perceived as being more structured, and languages are perceived as, quote unquote, not really having a grammar, which means not really perceived as worthy of being called a language. So you can see a bunch of examples here. I think there were 18 in total, but you can see some here. And we start with the good news, is that in Wales, actually Welsh was rated more highly, significantly so. So blue is the regional minority language, and red is the majority language, the language of the larger country. You see that Welsh was actually rated more highly. We did do this in North Wales, in Gwynedd and Ynys Môn, so obviously we are talking about a particular area. Things might be different in different areas. But this is good news for the language, to the extent that being perceived as being structured and pleasant and beautiful and so on has a tendency to come into the picture when people make decisions about using it. Now, the degree to which those decisions are conscious and unconscious, that's a very interesting question and one that we're trying to disentangle, but I'm not going to go into that. We'll leave that for the lecture after the one planned on the French. And in Belgium, the situation is relatively positive in the sense that the rating for the two languages wasn't, we didn't find any difference, meaning that both languages are sort of accepted as being more or less okay to the same degree. The situation is sad and also interesting, or maybe sad to the power of itself, in Lombardy, where you see the exact reverse situation. So Lombard is rated very low, Italian is rated very high. But there's also another interesting thing, which we have been calling the Italian delusion. Look how high Italian is compared to English and German. It's like Italian is amazing. I don't know what is wrong with these people, but it's serious. So why am I telling you this? Well, because there's clearly some cases where the languages are perceived positively, at least when tested through a relatively rudimentary test that says, is the language pleasant or not? As I said, we're working on more technologically advanced methods. We are hoping to have more data before the end of the year. But this in itself makes me a little bit optimistic. And this is definitely a Churchill quote. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Marco. Oedd hwnna'n yn ddiddorol dros ben. That was extremely interesting. So I'm sure there are lots of questions or comments. So I'll open up the floor. So who wants to ask the first question? Or make a comment or an observation?
So how did you choose the sample of people how did you choose the sample of people to give these questionnaires to?
We focused on the generation that are currently parents or eligible to be parents, so to speak. So we looked at 24 to 36-year-olds by looking at the average age of young parents in each location. And the idea was that these are the ones who are most likely to then give us an insight into what the future generation will be doing, because they have a direct connection, so to speak. Yeah.
Okay, there was a question at the
Sorry,
back.
Anthony, you do it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Marco. That was lovely. You know, I'm a speaker of Galicia, and I come from a place that is also under the administration, currently under the administration of the Spaniards at the moment. Yeah. And I was quite taken about what you were saying about the Lombard situation, because in Galicia as well, the numbers of speakers is quite high, but we know that when you start looking at the younger people, the figures are going dramatically down. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit more about generational transfer in Lombardy. What was the situation there in terms of parents deciding to speak Lombard to their children, or whether there are some grassroots initiatives, perhaps?
Thank you. Yes, I wish I had some data on Galician. When I put up Catalan, I felt a little bit sad that there wasn't some Galician in it. But no, the situation is as bad as it gets, in the sense that so first of all, for example, so as a segue to the previous question, we were looking for people between the ages of 24 and 36, and it was perfectly easy in Belgium and in Wales to find the people, not necessarily to find the people willing to do it, but they exist and there's loads of them relatively to the population. In Lombardy, it was really difficult. We had to keep going into more and more rural areas, because of course, it starts with the cities and then it spreads to the larger towns, and then it spreads to the towns, and then it spreads to the large villages, and until there's nowhere else to spread. So we had to keep going into more rural areas, and the majority of the people that age group tended to have learned it either from grandparents or from working with older people. So people who do apprenticeship, for example, and may work with people in their 50s or 60s, then there's a tendency. So it's sort of what you might call broken transmission. There is still some. It tends to be largely not direct from the parents, and definitely limited to rural areas. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question down here.
I wanted to ask a question that's basically what the entirety of linguistics is about, but I wanted to know how you differentiate between a language and a dialect. And I come from India. I speak quite a few Indian languages, and you mentioned that there are, okay, so I'll ask the question first. Bengali and Sylheti. Okay, these are two languages, but they're both considered different dialects of Bengali. Now, I speak a form of what is contemporarily known as Bengali in itself, but I cannot understand Sylheti for the life of me, like anything about it. But then again, Hindi and Urdu are two completely different languages. They're written in different scripts, but I can understand both languages almost completely. So how do you differentiate between the two?
You need to take my course on language planning, because we spent 4 weeks on that. So I'm not going to be able to shrink 4 weeks into that, but I will give you my take on it, which is that the only way in which the distinction makes sense is if we bring in intelligibility. And I know intelligibility. I know that is controversial. I know that may not necessarily be the mainstream position, but I refuse to believe that the statement, John and Mary speak the same language, means they may not be able to communicate. I think that's daft. So that is my take on it. I know it's controversial, as I said, but we spent 4 weeks on it in my language planning module. So speak to me after this, and we'll sign you up.
Absolutely love to.
Yes.
And sorry, one last thing. When you said that this is more of a nitpick, you can disagree, but when you said that you have to abandon a language you said that you don't have to abandon a language for social reasons. You were talking about when in an empire, it doesn't matter what language you speak as long as you're paying your taxes. And nowadays, if there is that sense of oneness or individuality that is required to make a people of a nation, you don't have to just keep one language and sort of push down other languages. But I think I disagree with that. The example would be if a certain area is taken by force and the people don't necessarily agree or want the government that has now taken over that area, I would assume that in a place like that, from the government's point of view, you would have to sort of suppress their own level of individuality so that they can be integrated into the...
No, I absolutely agree. What I was driving at is that we, the people, abandon our language by choice. That is a rather new thing. So the situation you're talking about, with the Romans killing everyone, and then the very few people who survive end up speaking some form of Latin, that is sort of possibly as old as human tribes, although the Romans industrialized it, but you more or less have the same situation. A situation when a group of people says, yes, I accept that my language needs to be abandoned for the good of the future and my children and the flag and the country and the nation. That is relatively new. That was my point. But of course, you have situations of colonization and invasion and so on, which linguistically are a bit more straightforward, right? People are forced to abandon it by pain of death. The sort of self-inflicted, or what the Galicians have called linguistic self-hatred, is as in, not my language, the language of that group, that's the one I want. That is more recent. Yeah.
Hi, Mark. I'm
Be
curious.
nice.
Sorry, again?
Don't ask me a difficult question.
No, this is a nice question. It's about Lombard. So I'm curious about the Galician and Lombard situation. So I think most of the languages in what is called Spain have got a lot of youth movements in protection. Like, people really have a lot of passion driving for it. Even Aragonese has a good movement. How is it with Lombard and or Piemontese, other languages in Italy?
There is activism, definitely. I think Veneto is possibly the best example. The activism is relatively strong and relatively widespread. In Lombardy, unfortunately, it tends to be politicized. So if you speak Lombard, you supposedly belong to a certain party, and if you don't, you belong to a different party, which never does any good for the language. In Veneto, it tends to be a bit more widespread across, social groups and across ideologies and so on. So there is activism. I think the comparison between Italy and Spain is one that keeps coming back, and it's absolutely crucially interesting. But it also goes back to the question that was being asked at the front here. In the case of Spain, you had overt, the Franco government overtly forbade people from speaking the languages, and when that ended, it sort of had a bit of an elastic band effect, right? You pull them in one direction and they all went in the other direction, or many, not all of them, but certainly Galicia, Catalonia, and so on. In Italy, it's always been, it's for your own good. It's, don't do this. That is good. This is bad for you, for your children. You don't want your children to be disadvantaged, do you? So it's been, you might say, internalized, and that, unfortunately, has turned out to be a lot more powerful and has made the people not react in the way that they reacted in Spain. Yeah.
Okay, there was a question.
So you said that language change comes from fighting for your language and fighting for keeping it, but obviously a prerequisite for that is that change in attitude. And I was just kind of wondering what ways people can elevate their perception or attitude of a language externally to making it like, I think Welsh, it really helps now that it's something that you can be very official with. You know, you can go all the way to university level education through Welsh, and I think that really helps with the perception. But in other places where that's not the case, what are some kind of ways to bring a minority language into higher prestige?
That's an excellent question. You two should do my language planning module. Yeah, but that's an excellent question. Again, trying to boil down 5 weeks in 50 seconds, it's a step-by-step procedure, because when you're in that situation that you just described, you're facing a paradox. On the one hand, you want to raise the status of the language, for example, by introducing it into schools or similar situations. On the other hand, you will have public outcries if you do that, because the status of the language is so low that people don't accept it in those contexts. And so you end up in a vicious cycle. And so small steps that extend the acceptance a little bit. Maybe we have street signs occasionally, every few streets, not every street, occasionally. And then people begin to accept that that's kind of okay. And then you keep moving in that direction. But if the changes are radical, then there's plenty of examples where it was basically shooting oneself in the foot. Yeah. And then the language kind of gets a lot of negative press, and then you have a bigger problem. But this is why the Welsh situation in particular, but also the Catalan and Galician situation to some degree, are so useful, because they've done exactly that. They've broken that vicious cycle, right? I suppose if I had the recipe, then I would have my own private jet, which I don't. But that's kind of the broad strokes, yeah. But thank you.
Okay, there's a question at the back.
Hi. I'm not really sure what I want to ask, but it's more a random thought. So you talked about studies in children showing more mental agility. I'm thinking at the other end of life, so my partner's father has dementia and he's deteriorating. I'm just wondering if there's kind of studies in learning languages at a later age are also of value, mainly because I'm using Duolingo quite a lot and I'm currently on
and you hope that will
languages,
save you.
I think.
No, that's an excellent question, and actually there has been research in that area. There's because it's very much in its infancy, there is disagreement as to what exactly is going on, but the most positive reports are that dementia particularly dementia, but generally degenerative brain diseases can be delayed up to 5 years in some cases. So that's the best end of the spectrum of the evidence. But as I said, this came from Canada, from French-English bilinguals. But there is a degree of, it's very new, and there is a degree of disagreement as to whether it's a delay or whether it is an actual change. And so basically the picture still needs quite a bit of research. But there are at least promising results that it's helping at the other end of the spectrum as well. Yes. Yeah.
Hello. What do you think of the Welsh settlers in Argentina as a model of saving an endangered language?
I do not think, because I know nothing about it. Thank you, but I'm sorry. Yeah, I can say nothing about that.
I think there was a hand up in the middle here. Yeah.
What's the situation of bilingual education in Italy generally? And is there any chance of that kind of improving or changing to get more bilingual education?
Yes, so in Italy you have you have a distinction between the recognized regional minority languages, of which Sardinian is one, and we saw the data on Sardinian, and it's not an accident that people study Sardinian, it's because it's accepted as a regional minority language by the government, and therefore there are funds to study it. And those languages have some degree of recognition. For example, you have bilingual signage. For example, if you go to a local authority's office, you can speak in Sardinian to some extent, but it is not fully integrated in the sense that you cannot use it in a court of law, for example. And in school is taught as a second language, and you have a few hours a week, but you don't have contact hours as you do with Catalan or with Welsh. So it's kind of in the right direction, even though it's behind the more successful cases. And in that sense, it's promising, because if it keeps moving, it'll get there eventually. And then you have the regional minority languages that are not recognized by the government, and those are basically, left to themselves and to the activism I was talking about when I was answering the earlier question.
We can squeeze in one more question if anybody has a burning question.
Was that a hand? No. Sorry, waving a fly, and I thought.
No? Oh, one quick question at the back.
I'd be interested to know, is there any emerging evidence of the development of new languages? A lot of the discussion this evening has been around loss of language.
I would say, okay, first of all, it's not an area I know much about, but one area that has attracted, in that direction, that has attracted quite a bit of interest is the development of urban Englishes, particularly London English, which is heavily influenced by both recent immigration and historical immigration, and starting from after the Second World War, well, in fact, after the collapse of the empire and so on. And there are so-called varieties of English, some of which are moving quite in a direction that is quite distant from standard English, and then there are questions of what do we do with that. And so that would be an example, I would say, of a language kind of born of an existing language, if you like. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all your interesting questions. So they've added
Thank
to the fantastic lecture that we've had this evening. So thank you all for coming, and let's thank Marco once more for this.
Thank you. Your point, please.